Hello friends and neighbors. As a point of interest, I would like to find out where you all get your books. This is just something I've become recently curious about. When you need a book that you don't own and you really want to read it, where do you most frequently get it? So I've created a poll, which I will link in the doobly dangly shooply under vunder down chamber of secrets bottom crotch bar thing. Pants. And there will also be a link at my website, italkstuff.com. Please go and vote. You can check as many options as you want, but please only check the ones that you actually do frequently. Don't check ones that you just do once in a while. I look forward to seeing the responses, and now, on to the video. So what am I doing? Thanks for joining me.
What are you filming for?
So today, in light of yesterday's challenge, I thought I would make a how-to video for books versus movies reviews. Or at least, I'll make a video for how I make books versus movies reviews. You can do it however you want, but this is my process. The process begins with, oh, the glare is crazy in my glasses. The process begins with picking out a book-movie combination. I get a hold of the book, and I get a hold of the movie, and I watch or rewatch it, and I read or reread it. This is just to make sure that all the differences are fresh in my brain, even if I have read it before or watched it before and I'm relatively familiar with it. As I am doing this, I will make note of the differences. Specifically looking at the major differences, like little nitpicky things I try not to focus on too much, but the major differences that are going to in some way sway my decision. And as I'm considering these differences, this is also about the time when I will start to come up with the categories that I'm going to use. Now, I use a pretty similar category framework. For example, I almost always talk about characters, imagery, and story at the very least. But it's still flexible. For example, I might have just 2 character categories, or I might have as many as 4 character categories, depending on whether or not there's a big main character, or 2 big main characters, or a major antagonist, or anything like that. In addition, while I usually talk about imagery, I don't always talk about imagery. Sometimes I replace it with composition. And of course, composition is a category that I use when there is something interesting going on with the composition of either the book or the movie. And with regards to imagery, I will try to pay very special attention to how the book describes things versus how the movie does things visually. That's usually a pretty difficult category to decide. Now, the order is usually pretty much the same. I usually start with characters and I end with story because I think that story is the most important aspect of any story, and that should be the deciding factor. However, this is not always the case. Sometimes the deciding factor is another important aspect of the story, like a character or something else. Like for Neverending Story, the deciding factor was the portrayal of the magical land. Once I figured out how the rounds are going to work, that's when I will start to figure out which one is better for book and which one is better for movie. Sometimes it's really obvious. One version definitely stands out over the other, but sometimes it's a toss-up. And those toss-up categories are typically the ones that I'll use when I will want to even up the score so that we go into the final category in a tie. I'm usually able to do this, though there have been a couple of times when I wasn't. Now, as you are deciding how the rounds are going to break down, then one of 3 things will be happening. First, you'll be finding that one of the 2 versions of the story is very definitely better than the other, to the point where there's not really any point in doing a full books versus movies review because every conceivable category you could come up with is being won by that one story. In that instance, I do a review of Shame, or a review of Fame, which you don't know what it is yet, but you will eventually. The second thing that could be happening is that one version is definitely better than the other, but the other still has plenty to offer that you can fight for, which is what I use for your standard and relatively easy books versus movies review. And the third thing that could be happening is that you could have what is essentially a tie, 2 versions of the story that are about equally good. And that's when it gets fun. These are the ones that I will typically try to use for tiebreakers, and these are also the ones that you'll typically see me muttering about as I'm walking down the street. So once you have made your final decision, you know how the rounds are going to work out, that's when you start writing the script. In writing the script, I try to make it so that it's not going on too long, but that I'm still covering all the major points. For simple stories, this is relatively easy, but for more complicated stories, this gets a little hard because you have to decide what is really important to your decision and what is just kind of a point of interest that doesn't really factor into it at all. Like, usually if 2 supporting characters in a story are pretty much comparable to each other, I'm not going to talk about them. Once the script is written and I've read over it a few times to make sure that everything is the way that it ought to be, then I start filming. Book mat goes there, movie mat goes there. Once everything is filmed, I capture the footage, and then it's time to edit. I usually start with the title screens, the things that you see between rounds, and I have one file that I just change around for every title screen. I just set the different covers in the background, and then I adjust the different rounds to show which one is winning. And then I edit, just like I would edit any vlog pretty much. I just put the footage together as I wrote it in the script and I edit. Now these reviews are usually around 20 to 30 minutes in length, and so editing can be a pretty lengthy process. If I were to sit down and edit everything pretty much straight through, it would probably take me about 2 to 3 hours. But I don't usually do that. The Neverending Story review that I just finished is a rare case where I did actually sit down and pretty much edit the whole thing straight through. But usually I'll edit a round, I'll take a break, I'll come back to it later, I'll edit the next round, and this process can take me about 4 or 5 days sometimes. And while I'm editing, I will also put in the movie clips. I use a piece of software called 4Media DVD Ripper that I downloaded online for about 40 bucks. It's a pretty good piece of software, but it doesn't always work properly, and so sometimes I do have to go to YouTube for my clips and download them from there. And if you're not interested in forking over the 40 bucks, which I completely understand, there is a video capture software that I used before that called Jing, which is completely free. But the quality isn't as good. Once I'm done with the editing, I will look over it again. Sometimes I'll cut things for time, and then I will export and upload. And that's pretty much it. I have now done 23 of these things. I'm preparing about 4 or 5 more, and it's a lot of fun. I love thinking about these things and trying to decide which versions I like better and spotting the differences. It's a lot of fun for me. One of you asked me what my favorite books versus movies review is, and that's kind of a hard question because there's so much that goes into these. From an analytical standpoint, I think my favorite is The Christmas Carol because that had a lot of comparisons to do and I really enjoyed doing that. From an editing standpoint, I love The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe review that I did because I liked putting all the different locations in there, and I also enjoyed doing the Neverending Story review with all the VidCon stuff. And from a writing standpoint, I'm still pretty proud of the V for Vendetta review that I did with Jesse. And Twilight, you dingbat. Twilight. You really liked the Twilight review. So that's it. I hope this answered some of your questions about books versus movies review. Now you know how much work goes into these, and maybe some of you will stop bugging me when I don't get them out very often. Just kidding, I love you guys. And that about does it for this VEDS video. Until next time, guys, we're halfway done. See you on the other side of September.